At 6 in the morning, on March 23, 1943, 50 tanks of the German 10th Panzer Division rolled out of a mountain pass in central Tunisia. The rumble of their engines echoed across the barren landscape as they advanced toward American positions held by the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. Dust clouds rose behind the panzers, visible for miles in the clear desert air. These were veteran crews, hardened by years of warfare under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. They had crushed American forces at Kasserine Pass just weeks before, sending Green troops fleeing in panic. They expected to do so again. The tanks quickly overran the forward American positions. Infantry scattered before the grinding treads. Machine gun nests fell silent as crews abandoned their weapons. For a few terrible minutes, it seemed the German assault would sweep everything before it, just as it had at Kasserine. Then the panzers hit an American minefield and slowed. Commanders halted to assess the obstacle. And in that moment of hesitation, something unprecedented happened. American artillery opened fire. Not one battery, not two, but a coordinated wall of steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Shells screamed down from multiple directions, all striking within seconds of each other. The German tank commanders had no time to react, no time to disperse, no warning whatsoever. One moment they were assessing a minefield. The next moment, explosions tore through their formation with savage precision. Brigadier General Clift Andrus, commanding the division artillery, watched the engagement unfold from his command post. Division artillery arrived at exactly the right moment, massing fire from multiple batteries. Andrus later recalled that the rounds hammered into the German battalion until the entire formation broke from cover and started to run for another position in the rear, but none ever reached it. His gunners tracked the fleeing vehicles and infantry with methodical precision, adjusting fire to follow them across the desert floor. Within an hour, 30 of the 50 German tanks lay burning in the Tunisian sand. Smoke rose from their hulls in black columns that could be seen for miles. General George Patton would later tell Andrus that this battle had taught him something he would never forget. The Americans had discovered a weapon the Germans could not match. Not a new tank, not a secret explosive. Something far more devastating. They had discovered how to coordinate artillery faster than any army in history. It was the first American victory over German armor in the war. It would not be the last. The United States Army fielded the fastest and most flexible artillery system of the Second World War. It was a system so revolutionary that German prisoners frequently asked their American captors to see the automatic guns that had bombarded them. They simply could not believe that human crews could deliver such devastating firepower so quickly. There had to be some kind of machine doing it, some mechanical device that fired shells like a belt-fed weapon. When told that ordinary men with ordinary cannons had created that storm of steel, many prisoners refused to believe it. General Dwight Eisenhower himself stated that the speed, accuracy, and devastating power of American artillery won confidence and admiration from the troops it supported and inspired fear and respect in their enemy. He was not exaggerating. The evidence was written in the faces of captured Germans and in the bodies they left on battlefields across Europe and North Africa. The secret was not in the guns themselves. American howitzers were good, reliable, and well-designed, but not dramatically superior to their German counterparts. The secret lay in an organizational innovation that existed nowhere else on Earth. It was called the Fire Direction Center, and it would change warfare forever. The Fire Direction Center was the brain of American artillery. It was a centralized computing and command hub, typically housed in a tent, building, or dugout behind the front lines, where a team of specialists received fire requests from observers near the enemy, calculated firing solutions using mathematics and specialized tools, and transmitted commands to the gun crews. Other armies had artillerymen. The Americans had a system. Before this innovation, artillery units in every army operated essentially the same way they had since Napoleon. Each battery computed its own firing data. Each battery commander made his own decisions based on what he could see or what messengers told him. Massing the fire of multiple batteries on a single target required extensive pre-planning and careful coordination that could take hours or even days to arrange. Responding quickly to unexpected targets of opportunity was nearly impossible. The fog of war and the friction of communication made rapid artillery response a fantasy. The American system changed everything. A single forward observer, a young lieutenant crouched in a foxhole within sight of the enemy, could pick up his radio and call for fire. His request travelled instantly to the Fire Direction Centre. Within seconds, specialists plotted the target on a gridded map, measured the range and direction to the target from the gun positions, consulted pre-computed firing tables, applied corrections for wind and temperature and altitude, and even the rotation of the Earth, and transmitted precise commands to every gun in the battalion. All guns received identical data simultaneously. Rounds were in the air within 3 minutes of the original call. 3 minutes from request to steel on target. The Germans needed 10 to 12 minutes to respond to the same kind of unexpected threat. That time difference, measured in seconds but paid for in thousands of lives, became one of the decisive asymmetries of the European war. The Fire Direction Centre required a team of highly trained specialists working in perfect coordination under pressure. The fire direction officer served as the tactical decision-maker, determining which targets to engage and how many guns to assign based on the tactical situation. The horizontal control operator plotted targets on a large gridded map called a firing chart, measuring range and deflection in mils, a unit of angular measurement where 6,400 mils equals a full circle. The vertical control operator calculated altitude corrections for targets higher or lower than the guns. The computers, and in those days that word meant human beings performing calculations rather than electronic machines, extracted firing data from tables and verified every computation twice. A radio man maintained communications with the observers at the front and the gun crews behind. All personnel were cross-trained so the centre could operate continuously, 24 hours a day, through exhaustion and casualties and chaos. If one man fell, another could take his place without missing a fire mission. The equipment was ingeniously designed for speed and accuracy. The firing chart showed the terrain in detail, with battery positions carefully surveyed and marked. Plotting boards allowed rapid measurement of angles and distances. But the most important tool was something called the graphical firing table, a specialized wooden slide rule that eliminated pages of complex ballistic mathematics. The graphical firing table was invented in late 1940 by Captain Abbott Harrington Burns at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Burns had grown frustrated with what he called the slow torture of intricate mathematics. Traditional firing tables ran 76 pages of fine print, filled with numbers that had to be interpolated and cross-referenced. Extracting data required trained officers with mathematical backgrounds and considerable time, even under ideal conditions. In combat, with shells falling and radios crackling, errors multiplied and delays stretched. Burns experimented with a homemade paper slide rule and discovered that the complex ballistic calculations could be reduced to sliding scales that anyone could read. Range on one scale, elevation on another, drift correction on a third. Slide the scales to align with your data and read the answer directly. No interpolation, no page flipping, no higher mathematics. Major George Keyser recognized the potential and helped Burns refine the device for every weapon and powder charge in the Army inventory. The results were revolutionary. Tests proved that enlisted men with basic grocery store arithmetic could compute firing data more than 20 times faster than trained officers using traditional methods, and they made fewer errors. The graphical firing table became standard equipment in every American artillery unit and remained in service for decades after the war, but the Fire Direction Center was only half the system. The other half consisted of the forward observers who found the targets and adjusted the fire onto them. These men had perhaps the most dangerous job in the entire artillery branch, and their casualty rates proved it. Forward observers were typically lieutenants from the Field Artillery Battalion, accompanied by a sergeant and a radio man. They operated at the very edge of the battlefield, often the most forward artillerymen in the entire division, sometimes ahead of the infantry they supported. They crawled through mud and snow and jungle to find positions where they could see the enemy. They called in coordinates while bullets cracked past their heads and mortar rounds exploded nearby. They adjusted fire while German artillery searched for them, knowing that their radio transmissions could give away their position. Their casualty rates were extraordinary. During the Battle of the Bulge, forward observer teams suffered losses that sometimes exceeded 50% in prolonged engagements. The 15th Field Artillery Battalion at Elsenborn Ridge saw the majority of its forward observers evacuated for wounds or exposure over just 6 days of fighting. Some battalions went through their entire complement of observers multiple times during a campaign. Replacements arrived, learned the job under fire, and often became casualties themselves within days. A call for fire followed a precise format that observers memorized until it became automatic. The observer transmitted his identification code, then a warning order announcing a fire mission, then the target location given either by grid coordinates or by shift from a known reference point that had been pre-registered. He described what he was seeing and requested specific ammunition types and fuse settings based on the target. The Fire Direction Center processed his request, and guns fired. The observer watched where the shells landed through binoculars or a spotting scope, estimated the error, and sent corrections. Add 50. Write 30. The Fire Direction Center applied the corrections and guns fired again. The observer repeated the process, bracketing the target with rounds long and short, then systematically halving the bracket until shells struck home. Then he transmitted the words that every artilleryman waited to hear. Fire for effect. And every available gun opened up with maximum rate of fire. The observers communicated using FM radios, the SCR 609 and 610 models, which operated on frequencies between 27 and 39 MHz, with a range of roughly 5 miles under good conditions. FM modulation was critical because it cut through the static caused by nearby artillery blasts that made AM communications nearly impossible in combat. When positions were static, observers could also use EE8 field telephones connected by wire, which were more reliable but vulnerable to being cut by shellfire or vehicles or simply buried under debris. Aerial observers flying in small L4 Grasshopper spotter planes directed as much as 95% of artillery fire in some sectors. These unarmed aircraft, little more than fabric-covered trainers with military markings, circled above the battlefield, spotting targets and adjusting fire with a perspective no ground observer could match. German soldiers learned to fear the slow drone of their engines overhead because it meant accurate artillery would follow within minutes. The most devastating technique in the American arsenal was something called time on target. This required rounds from multiple batteries at different ranges and different positions to strike a single target at exactly the same instant, within plus or minus 3 seconds. Each battery computed its own time of flight based on the range to the target, subtracted that time from a designated impact time, and fired at the calculated moment so that all shells would arrive simultaneously. The physics of why this mattered were simple but brutal. When the first shells of a conventional barrage hit, soldiers react. They dive into foxholes, crawl behind walls, throw themselves flat against the ground. This instinctive response takes only seconds, but dramatically reduces casualties. Army studies showed that the majority of soldiers in a target area were standing fully exposed at the moment of first impact. Within 2 seconds, most had begun to react. After 8 seconds, virtually everyone was prone with some form of protective cover. Taking cover reduced casualties dramatically, often by half or more. A conventional rolling barrage gives troops those precious seconds of warning from the first impacts. Time on target eliminates that warning entirely. One moment there is complete silence, perhaps the whistle of incoming rounds for a fraction of a second. The next moment, dozens or hundreds of shells detonate at once across the target area. Maximum rounds arrive when maximum targets are exposed. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Survivors described it as being struck by lightning from a clear sky, violence without warning or precedent. German prisoners who experienced time-on-target barrages frequently suffered from severe shell shock, convinced they had faced some new superweapon rather than coordinated conventional artillery. The system that could deliver such firepower so quickly did not appear overnight. It was the product of 2 decades of institutional innovation at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, work that proceeded in obscurity while the world lurched toward another war, and it began with a single officer who saw what others could not. Major Carlos Brewer graduated from West Point in 1913 and had taught mathematics there before the First World War. In the late 1920s, he became director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill. Brewer looked at how artillery had been employed for centuries and saw inefficiency everywhere. Batteries operated independently like separate small armies. Coordination between them required complex arrangements and physical messengers. The mathematics of fire direction were performed separately by each unit, duplicating effort and slowing response times. There had to be a better way. Brewer proposed something radical. What if all the fire direction calculations for an entire battalion were centralized in a single location? What if one team of specialists computed data for all the batteries at once, using a common map and common reference points? What if targets could be identified on that common map and fire shifted instantly from one point to another without lengthy coordination? In the spring of 1931, Brewer's gunnery department demonstrated the concept on the firing ranges at Fort Sill. A battalion successfully massed fire using the new centralized method against targets of opportunity. The results were dramatic. Fire could be concentrated on any target that any single battery had adjusted on in a matter of minutes rather than hours. A few specialists could perform the technical work for the entire battalion more accurately than individual batteries had managed on their own. The Fire Direction Center was born. Major Orlando Ward succeeded Brewer and further developed the system, transforming the battalion commander from an administrator managing separate batteries into a true fire director who could control devastating concentrated firepower with a few words into a radio. Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones worked alongside them to motorize field artillery, ensuring that guns could move fast enough to support mobile operations rather than being tied to fixed positions by horse-drawn transport. All three innovators were supported by an officer who would become one of the most important figures in American military history, though his name is barely remembered today. Lesley McNair had been thinking about artillery since the trenches of 1918. As a young captain serving as senior artillery officer of the training section, he had watched American infantry advance with fixed bayonets against German machine guns, slaughtered by the thousands because artillery support was inadequate, uncoordinated, and slow. The lessons burned into his memory. He became the American Expeditionary Force's foremost artillery thinker. By October of 1918, at age 35, he was promoted to temporary brigadier general, the youngest in the entire army. Between the wars, McNair served at Fort Sill as assistant commandant, championing the innovations that Brewer and Ward were developing and pushing them toward practical implementation. George Marshall called McNair the brains of the army. When war came, McNair became responsible for training all American ground forces for combat. He was determined that the artillery disasters of 1918 would not be repeated. American soldiers would go into battle supported by the most effective artillery in the world. The Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941 tested the new system at scale. Nearly 500,000 troops maneuvered across 3,400 square miles of Louisiana in the largest peacetime training exercise in American history. The exercises pitted two hypothetical armies against each other in realistic combat scenarios, with umpires assessing casualties and judging outcomes. McNair deliberately designed the exercises to expose weaknesses before they could cost lives in combat. He wanted units to fail in Louisiana rather than in France or Germany. Better to learn harsh lessons on American soil than pay for them in American blood on foreign battlefields. The maneuvers revealed which officers could lead and which could not. Marshall used the exercises to push out 31 of 42 senior army commanders who proved unfit for modern mobile warfare. Some had been heroes in the last war but could not adapt to new conditions. They were retired or reassigned, and younger, more aggressive officers took their places. More importantly for artillery, the maneuvers validated the Fire Direction Center concept under realistic field conditions and tested FM radio communications between observers and guns, motorized artillery movement and displacement under simulated combat pressure, and the use of small spotter aircraft to direct fire from positions no ground observer could reach. Problems were identified and fixed. Procedures were refined. By the time the exercises ended, the American artillery system was ready for war. The official doctrine was published as Field Manual 6-40 on October 10, 1939, but refinements continued based on maneuver experience. By the time America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, every field artillery battalion had a functioning fire direction center staffed by trained personnel equipped with graphical firing tables and FM radios. The system awaited only combat to prove itself against a real enemy. McNair himself was killed on July 25, 1944, when American bombs fell short while he observed Operation Cobra near St. Lo in Normandy. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The massive bombardment that day combining nearly 2,000 heavy bombers with over 1,000 artillery pieces firing tens of thousands of rounds, was designed to shatter the German line and enable the breakout from Normandy. McNair never knew how completely his vision had been vindicated. The true test of the American artillery system came not in training exercises, but in the desperate battles of 1944 and 45. And nowhere was its superiority more dramatically demonstrated than at a small hill in Normandy called Hill 314. On August 7, 1944, 4 German panzer divisions launched Operation Lüttich, a desperate counterattack aimed at cutting off Patton's breakout at Avranches and potentially trapping American forces in Brittany. Roughly 300 tanks and 26,000 troops from some of Germany's best remaining divisions, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 116th Panzer Division, struck the American 30th Infantry Division, known as Old Hickory. On Hill 314, overlooking the town of Mortain, approximately 700 American soldiers found themselves surrounded when German forces swept past them in the darkness. Among these defenders were 2 forward observer teams from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz and 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss, along with their small crews including Corporal Frank Denius and Radio Sergeant Sid Goldstein, established observation positions on the hilltop, with commanding views of the German approaches. The afternoon before the attack, anticipating that something might happen, Bartz and Weiss had pre-registered numbered fire concentrations on every road, intersection, and likely avenue of approach around their position. They assigned numbers to each concentration and recorded them on their maps and in their notebooks. When the German assault came, the observers needed only to radio a concentration number and shells were on the way. No lengthy coordinate transmissions under fire, no complex adjustments, just a number and the words "fire for effect." Lieutenant Weiss called in 193 fire missions over 6 days and nights, barely sleeping, eating only what could be scrounged from abandoned positions. Frank Denius, just 19 years old and from Austin, Texas, occupied the west side of the hill with views toward Mortain and the north, while Weiss covered the east and south. Between them they laid a solid ring of steel around their position. German tanks and infantry that approached found themselves walking into precisely targeted killing zones. Denius later explained their method. "I would plot out emergency barrage numbers and normal barrage numbers. During an attack, an observer only had to request emergency barrage number 1, and the gunners would know exactly where to fire without any additional information. The system saved crucial seconds when seconds meant lives. Those 2 lieutenants on that single hilltop could call upon division artillery and corps artillery assets, including heavy 155mm howitzers. An average of 2,000 artillery rounds per day supported the surrounded battalion on Hill 314. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wieman, commanding the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, became famous for his 3-word response to every fire mission: "On the way." No hesitation, no questions, just immediate support for his observers trapped on the hill. When ammunition ran short on the hilltop and resupply convoys could not break through, Wieman improvised a solution that artillerymen still discuss. He removed propaganda leaflets from base ejection shell casings and repacked them with blood, plasma, morphine, bandages, and other medical supplies. Then he fired the modified shells to the besieged troops. Artillery pieces designed to deliver destruction instead delivered salvation. Of the 700 defenders who began the fight, roughly 300 were killed or wounded over 6 days of continuous combat. When the 35th Division finally broke through on August 12, 376 survivors walked off Hill 314. The forward observers who had directed that relentless curtain of steel became legends within the artillery community. The German counteroffensive was shattered. Artillery, directed by 2 lieutenants with radios, had stopped multiple panzer divisions cold. The Germans understood what they were facing, even if they could not replicate it. Interrogation reports from the period reveal their grudging admiration and growing fear. A January 1945 Field Artillery School publication compiled statements from German prisoners. The Germans were unanimous in their respect for Allied artillery. They reported that artillery fire caused them to feel insecure along the entire front. The demoralizing effect of around-the-clock shelling created helplessness, panic, and confusion in their ranks. Personnel of all arms were paralyzed and terrorized. German prisoners repeatedly asked their American captors to see the automatic guns that had bombarded them. They were convinced some mechanical device must be firing those shells with such speed and accuracy. When shown that ordinary cannons worked by ordinary crews had created the barrages they experienced, many simply refused to believe it. The simultaneity of time-on-target fire created the impression of a single enormous automatic weapon, rather than dozens of independent batteries firing in precise coordination. German veterans compiled their assessment succinctly. Their greatest fear when confronting Americans was the crackle of a radio because it meant overwhelming accurate artillery was about to descend. One German officer reportedly knew the war was lost when he observed Americans dumping mountains of 155mm shells by the side of roads during a retreat, discarding ammunition as not important enough to transport. His own guns rationed every precious round. The Germans could not replicate the American system despite understanding its principles. This was not due to lack of technical competence. German artillery officers were skilled professionals, often excellent at their craft, but replication required a convergence of factors that Germany simply could not assemble. German fire direction required knowledge of the relative range and bearing between the target, the observer, and the battery, forming a triangular calculation far more complex than the American and British method, which needed only the map positions of target and battery. Germany developed no equivalent to the battalion-level fire direction center that could mass fire flexibly. Forward observers were tied to controlling specific batteries, with no shared radio nets, allowing rapid massing of fire from multiple units. Industrial capacity formed another insurmountable obstacle. The American system depended on mass radio production that put FM sets in every forward observer team, every fire direction center, and many individual gun positions. The United States manufactured over 100,000 SCR 536 walkie-talkies alone, plus tens of thousands of larger vehicle-mounted sets. Germany could not approach this output with its bombed factories and scarce materials. American vehicles were fully motorized, while much German artillery remained horse-drawn throughout the war, limiting mobility and responsiveness. American ammunition production was virtually unlimited, while German factories, increasingly worked by prisoners and slave laborers, produced shells with dud rates as high as 70% for some calibers due to deliberate sabotage. By 1944, German artillery in Normandy could fire only roughly 10% of what the British fired in the same sector, and a fraction of American expenditures. The British, incidentally, had developed the second-best artillery system of the war. Their response times matched the Americans at about 3 minutes for basic fire missions. British Corps Commander Sir Brian Horrocks wrote that neither the Germans, nor the Russians, nor even the French, who were supposed to be masters of artillery, could approach the accuracy or weight of concentrated firepower that he had at his disposal in a matter of minutes. The Soviet Union called artillery the god of war and employed it through sheer mass on a scale no other army attempted. At the Battle of Silo Heights in April 1945, over 9,000 guns and rocket launchers, along an 18-mile front, fired an estimated 500,000 shells in the first 30 minutes alone. But Soviet doctrine relied on centralized, pre-planned fire, with rigid timetables, set hours or days in advance. After initial barrages, German observers noted, there was no longer any question of close fire control in fluid situations. Soviet artillery excelled at set-piece offensives, where everything could be planned but performed poorly in meeting engagements and fluid battles. Those were exactly the situations where the American Fire Direction Center proved decisive. The distinguished military historian Trevor Dupois concluded after extensive analysis that the Fire Direction Center system was perhaps the most important reason why American artillery, by the end of the Second World War, was simply the best in the world. The greatest test of the system came in December 1944, when Hitler launched his last major offensive through the Ardennes forest. The main German effort, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, including the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, aimed at the thinly held American front near Elsenborn Ridge, hoping to break through to Antwerp and split the Allied armies. The Green 99th Infantry Division and battle-hardened 2nd Infantry Division absorbed the initial shock. Major General Walter Robertson of the 2nd Division executed one of the war's most difficult maneuvers, a daylight withdrawal while in contact, pulling back through collapsing lines to defend the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt, then withdrawing again to Elsenborn Ridge itself. Behind the ridge, American artillery massed in force. On December 19, 5th Corps Artillery fired nearly 6,000 rounds at Krinkelt and Rocherath alone. On December 22, at nearby Dom-Butgenbach, the 1st Infantry Division's artillery fired 10,000 rounds in a single day against attacking German formations, trying to overwhelm American positions. The results were annihilating. American patrols reported that dead SS troopers, many only 15 or 16 years old, were as common as grass in front of their positions. Graves registration teams conducting their grim work after the battle counted 782 German bodies in front of just one regiment's positions. The official army history recorded that artillery throughout the fight offered the first line of anti-tank defense, immobilizing many panzers before they reached the foxhole line, leaving them with broken tracks and sprocket wheels like crippled geese in front of a hunter. The 155mm batteries proved best at stopping tanks, their heavy shells cracking armor and shattering running gear. On December 26, the 246th Volksgrenadier Division made a final desperate assault on Elsenborn Ridge. It was mowed down by artillery fire virtually at the moment of its start, before the attacking infantry could close with American positions. Elsenborn Ridge was the only sector of the entire American front where the German offensive completely failed to advance. Not 1 yard of ground was permanently lost. During the entire Battle of the Bulge, American forces fired 1,255,000 artillery rounds from 4,155 guns. That weight of steel broke the back of Hitler's last gamble. At besieged Bastogne, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper, held the critical western perimeter. Cooper had moved aggressively to get his unit into the fight, volunteering his battalion to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe when the crisis erupted. He brought 27 trucks, full winter gear for his men, and crucially, armor-piercing ammunition left over from Italy that was not listed on any official ammunition report. Also defending Bastogne was the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, a segregated unit with black enlisted men and white officers that provided critical fire support, alongside the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. These men served in an army that questioned their abilities and often assigned them to support roles rather than combat. At Bastogne they proved their worth beyond any doubt, firing thousands of rounds in defense of the perimeter and earning commendation from commanders who had previously harbored doubts about African-American soldiers in combat. The unit became the first African-American combat unit to receive the Distinguished Unit Citation presented by Major General Maxwell Taylor on February 7, 1945. At 3:30 in the morning on Christmas Day, Forward Observer Sergeant Joseph Rogan watched from his frozen foxhole at Hemrul as 18 German tanks materialized from the pre-dawn darkness, rolling toward Cooper's howitzer positions barely 100 yards away. Cooper held fire to ensure positive identification and maximize the element of surprise. Men gripped their weapons in the bitter cold and waited, breath frosting in the December air. At dawn, Cooper gave the order. His gunners engaged the tanks with direct fire at point-blank range, including those armor-piercing rounds from Italy. Artillerymen fought as infantry with carbines and bazookas when German tanks closed too near for the howitzers to engage. The fighting was desperate and close. All 18 German tanks were destroyed within hours. Not one survived the day. From December 19th through the 31st, the 463rd fired 7,676 rounds across a full 360-degree defensive perimeter. A new weapon made its debut during the Bulge that amplified the devastation of American artillery beyond anything seen before. The VT proximity fuse used a tiny radar transmitter to detect when a shell passed close to a target, detonating it 30 to 50 feet above the ground. This rendered foxholes useless. An artillery round no longer needed to land directly in a position to kill its occupants. It only needed to pass overhead. Colonel Oscar Axelson, of the 406th Artillery Group, authorized use of the proximity fuse on December 16, the first day of the German offensive, even before Eisenhower issued formal authorization. At Malmedy, proximity-fused rounds so unnerved attacking SS troops under Colonel Otto Skorzeny that some reportedly charged directly into the artillery fire, screaming the German word for surrender. By December 23, an estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds alone. General Patton wrote to the War Department that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. His forces caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River and killed by actual count 702 enemy soldiers with a single concentrated barrage. German commanders offered rewards for soldiers who could recover an unexploded fuse for analysis. Few were ever found. The human cost of these battles was measured not only in German casualties but in American sacrifices. First Lieutenant John Fox, a 29-year-old forward observer from Cincinnati serving with Cannon Company of the 366th Infantry Regiment, while attached to the 598th Field Artillery Battalion, found himself at Somma-Colonia in Italy on December 26, 1944. German troops overran the village during a winter offensive, pouring through the streets in overwhelming numbers. Fox was an African-American officer in a segregated army, serving in a unit that received less support and fewer supplies than white formations. Despite these obstacles, he had become an expert forward observer. As enemy soldiers filled the streets around his position, Fox called in artillery increasingly close to his own location. When warned that the fire would impact directly on top of him, Fox gave his final transmission. "Fire it! There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell!" The barrage killed Fox and approximately 100 German soldiers surrounding his position, buying time for American forces to organize a counterattack. Due to racial discrimination in the wartime army, Fox received no recognition for his sacrifice. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 1997 by President Clinton, one of 7 African-American soldiers from the Second World War, belatedly honored more than 50 years after their deaths. His widow Arlene received the medal on his behalf. Such stories illuminate what statistics alone cannot convey. In the European theater, artillery and mortar fire caused 64% of all American battle deaths. In the Mediterranean theater, that figure reached 69%. In the Pacific, 47%. A single 105mm time fuse shell, bursting at 15 yards altitude, sprayed lethal fragments across an area 40 yards wide and 5 yards deep. The weapon that killed so many Americans killed even more Germans, because Americans could employ it faster, more accurately, and in greater volume than any opponent could match. The organizational scale of American artillery staggered the imagination. An infantry division fielded 48 artillery pieces, organized into 4 battalions. 3 battalions equipped with 105mm howitzers provided direct support, while 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers delivered heavier firepower. By war's end, 238 separate non-divisional field artillery battalions operated in Europe alone, available to reinforce divisions as needed. The standard M2A1 howitzer, in the 105mm caliber, could fire 10 rounds per minute at maximum rate, 3 rounds per minute sustained, to a range of just over 7 miles. Total wartime production of this single weapon reached 8,536 pieces. 1 out of every 5 shells fired by the United States during the entire war was a 105mm high explosive round. Total artillery ammunition produced from Pearl Harbor to VJ Day approached 1 billion rounds, valued at $7 billion in 1945 currency. Monthly production in 1944 averaged nearly 2.5 million rounds across all types and calibers. The logistics of moving this ammunition from American factories to European gun positions represented one of the great organizational achievements of the war, with shells traveling thousands of miles by ship and truck and rail to reach the batteries that would fire them. When the American Ninth Army crossed the Rhine River in March 1945, 2,070 guns opened fire simultaneously in a time-on-target barrage. 1,000 rounds per minute struck the far bank in a continuous curtain of explosions. Over 65,000 total rounds were fired in the opening bombardment alone. Veterans recalled that the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and the sky turned red, with muzzle flashes stretching to the horizon in both directions. German defenders on the far bank simply ceased to exist as organized units. Those who survived the bombardment surrendered in shock, many with blood streaming from their ears and noses from the concussion of thousands of simultaneous detonations. One soldier who witnessed the Rhine crossing wrote home that he had never seen anything like it and hoped he never would again. Just about every artillery outfit fired on the east side of the Rhine at the same time, he reported. The noise was beyond description. The ground shook like an earthquake that would not stop. And across the river, Nothing moved except the flames. The system that proved so decisive continued to evolve after the war ended. The same architecture served in Korea with minimal changes, achieving average response times of 4.5 minutes with the same howitzers and the same tactics that had broken German divisions. In Vietnam, fire support bases across South Vietnam employed the identical observer to fire direction center to gun line structure, though response times lengthened to approximately 11 minutes due to additional coordination requirements in a more complex tactical environment where distinguishing friend from foe required extra verification steps. The Cold War produced computerized descendants of the wartime system. The Tactical Fire Direction System, known by its acronym, became the first fully automated fire direction system, directly performing the calculations that wartime personnel had done with graphical firing tables and slide rules. Its successor, the Advanced Field Artillery Tactical Data System, served for nearly 3 decades as the digital heir to Carlos Brewer's original concept, coordinating fires not just from artillery but from mortars, rockets, aircraft, attack helicopters, and naval guns into a single integrated network. Modern conflicts continue to validate the principles established at Fort Sill. Ukraine's forces use a smartphone application called Kropiva that serves as a modern fire direction center equivalent, digitally linking observers with GPS coordinates to guns that can respond in minutes. Russian artillery doctrine still emphasizes massed, pre-planned fire in the tradition of Soviet methods, with the same limitations in flexibility that hampered the Red Army 80 years ago. Analysts observing that conflict note that without digitalization, artillery typically reacts too slowly and relies too much on weight of fire to achieve effects. The words could have been written about the German army in 1944. The fundamental insight that Carlos Brewer grasped in the 1920s remains valid today. Centralized fire direction using common maps and rapid communications multiplies the effectiveness of artillery beyond what any number of independently operating batteries can achieve. The technology has advanced beyond recognition, but the architecture has not. Observer to computing center to guns. See, calculate, fire, speed kills. The American artillery system of the Second World War was not the product of a single genius or a single invention. It emerged from institutional innovation at Fort Sill across an entire decade, from industrial capacity that no other nation could match, from mathematical education that produced enlisted personnel capable of rapid ballistic computation, from communication technology mass-produced in quantities that made universal radio coverage possible, and from a military culture willing to decentralize authority to the lowest competent level, rather than hoarding decisions at the top. The Germans had excellent individual gun crews. The British had comparable response times for battery-level fires. The Soviets deployed more tubes per mile of front than anyone else. But only the Americans combined speed, precision, flexibility, and overwhelming volume into a unified system where a single lieutenant on a surrounded hilltop could direct the fires of a dozen battalions onto any point he could observe. That capability, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of engagements throughout the war, was not merely a tactical advantage, it was strategic. It compensated for infantry that German veterans considered less skilled than their own. It broke counterattacks before they could build momentum. It turned open ground into killing zones and made every American radio a potential weapon of annihilation. General Patton rendered his verdict plainly. "I do not have to tell you who won the war. You know. The artillery did." The men who created this system worked in obscurity during the lean years between the wars, when the army was small and underfunded and public attention focused elsewhere. Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward and Lesley McNair experimented and refined and trained, while others dismissed their work as theoretical. They built something that would save countless lives and shorten a terrible conflict. The forward observers who risked everything at the edge of battle, the fire direction center crews who computed solutions while shells fell around them, the gun crews who served their howitzers until barrels glowed red from continuous fire, they proved what the innovators had envisioned. They demonstrated that information and coordination could multiply the effect of physical force beyond what brute strength alone could ever achieve. Today, the descendants of their system continue to serve. The principles established on the Oklahoma plains nearly a century ago still govern how Western armies deliver fire against their enemies. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The architecture has not. Those German prisoners asking to see the automatic guns understood something profound, even if they misidentified the mechanism. They had faced not merely American artillery, but American ingenuity, the ability to organize and coordinate and systematize that would prove as decisive as any weapon in the arsenal of democracy. The machine they imagined was real. It was just not made of metal. It was made of trained minds, working together toward a common purpose, transforming ordinary weapons into instruments of overwhelming coordinated power. That transformation represents one of the genuine achievements of American military innovation in the 20th century, a victory of organization and forethought as much as of courage and sacrifice. The men who served the guns and the men who called the fire deserve to be remembered for what they accomplished. They faced the finest army in the world and broke it with mathematics and radios and shells falling from the sky in torrents no enemy could withstand.